Hello, I'm Jason Epstein, Product Manager at Ranorex and your moderator for today's session. If this is your first time to attend a Ranorex webinar, we're the team behind Ranorex Studio, which is a UI test automation solution for desktop, web, and mobile apps. Ranorex is part of the Idera family of DevOps tools that includes TestRail, Travis CI, and others that you may recognize here. So we're planning on a 60-minute webinar today, which will include about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by live Q&A. If you have any questions for our team during that webinar, please use the Q&A panel, which is normally on the top right side of the GoToWebinar screen. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording or share it with others in your organization. So expect that link to be sent out within 48 hours after the conclusion of this webinar. If you do ask questions, please make sure that you maintain the topic that we're discussing today, as we won't be diving into any other topics. We're excited. Our speaker today is Janet Gregory, a renowned Agile consultant, trainer, writer, and speaker. She co-authored Agile Testing, More Agile Testing, and Agile Testing Condensed with Lisa Crispin, and she also co-founded the Agile Testing Fellowship. Janet, we're excited to have you join us to discuss holistic testing in DevOps, so let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today to listen to me talk about holistic testing in DevOps. The other part of that is what managers need to know. And so I think it's really a good combination, because often I talk only to the teams, but managers, they're part of it. And so they need to know things too. My Twitter ID is on here. If you want to tweet, please do so, at Janet Gregory CA. And at the very end, I'll have a slide with my contact information. I'm going to try to talk about, but I'm going to try to answer these questions. What is DevOps? Why is it important? What does it mean to product delivery? Because I think sometimes we forget about that. How does it affect how we test? And a little bit about the tester's role. Not everybody has testers these days. And what can we do to adapt? At least I'm going to try to answer those. If you have other questions along the way, please make a note and ask during the Q&A, because I'm going to leave hopefully a good 15 minutes to allow for that. Let's start with the business drivers. Quite often DevOps is pushed by the team, and there's very good reasons why organizations move to Agile or to DevOps. The goal for a company should not be to, do DevOps, just like it should never be to do Agile. The goal is to deliver products to help the people as well as the companies to run a successful business. And in today's market, organizations can't afford to be left behind. So we want to mitigate business risk. We want to make less of an impact to the customers. We want to really look at our business strategies to deliver quality code to production more often, so we have the choice whether to release or not. Also, reducing the impact of big releases. So I remember years ago when we used to wait for a year or two and then cross our fingers and hope that it would release correctly, right? But quite often we'd have deployment failures and massive rollbacks. We want to get rid of that, because then it increases the confidence. The more we practice, the smaller the releases, the less risk, and we get better confidence. We get better consistency in how we deliver our products. Often when I hear people talk about DevOps, I hear, the buzzwords: continuous delivery, continuous deployment, testing in production. It's all about the tools, the build pipeline, and more about the tools. But in reality, it's about these values and principles. These address the business drivers. So we use those practices from that previous slide to help us accomplish delivering valuable products. These are the same things we talk about when we say agile, but with DevOps, the focus brings operations into the picture. It helps us get consistency in that release. I know that whenever I'm on a team that works in an agile fashion, we always thought about operations, but not all teams did. So DevOps brings that to the forefront, and I think it helps us concentrate that way. But it means that the infrastructure of the system needs to change. So it makes it a lot harder for a lot of teams, perhaps those that are having big monoliths yet and haven't been able to change that infrastructure. Katrina Clokey, author of Practical Guide to Testing in DevOps, highly recommended, by the way, says that when we think about testing, it's a repeatable, recorded communication of automated feedback. That's how we get that testing into what we do. It includes the test and deployment scripts, right, from development and operations. Now, in this slide, I underlined the word continuous. But unfortunately, it's become a real buzzword, and sometimes it's been hijacked to mean automation only. And I don't think that's true. So I started using the word holistic. It just feels better to me. Now, DevOps is not a team. We all know that, right? It's a collaboration between the delivery team, which includes, development, testers, business, the operations team, perhaps administrators. It's a cross-functional team. And that cross-functional team can do many things, but it can't do it alone. It needs the support of leadership. Right? We want to focus on the outcomes, stability, what makes it. So let's think of an example. If a product management group consistently or constantly wants to deliver more and more and more features all the time without giving time for the team to learn, to maybe fix that infrastructure, giving them time to do their job well, it's setting that team up for failure, right? So we want to embed that operations knowledge in everything a team does. Sometimes you have a platform team that helps develop that pipeline and maintains it. That team would work very closely with those, the agile teams, the delivery teams. Now, when we think about how we do testing, when there are no long test and fix cycles, that let's code for 2 months and then stabilize it, right? All of a sudden, teams have more time to innovate. If we have stable releases, we can try new things, we can improve. Teams don't waste as much time with broken test environments or that throw it over the wall to testers and get it back and, that whole cycle thing. We don't have that anymore. Or maybe throwing it over to operations. Here, you go deploy it, deal with the customer. We're not having that as much when we're working in a true DevOps fashion. The automated deployments, the standardized production environments, these are key aspects of the DevOps models, making the deployments predictable. The routine tasks are automated, and that's a good thing, right? We will start to think about instrumenting the code for logging and monitoring, thinking about that pipeline, how to get the feedback cycles shorter. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. It is about reducing cycle time. There is less risk when you have smaller releases, right? So the smaller the release, the easier it is to look if something went wrong, right? From say 1 to 2 years down to every month, maybe down to every week. Some teams are releasing multiple times a day. Doesn't mean it's going to the customer's hands, but they're able to see that full cycle. And that's what reduces the risk. Now, to make that successful, a team needs to have the shared understanding of the features and how it is implemented. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular slide, but I took this from the latest DevOps survey report. And what the changes are from, waterfall to small batches. These are some of the major changes that have happened and how teams have addressed them, because not everybody addresses them the same way, right? They're high level things, right? But it's having that early involvement with your stakeholders, really thinking about what does it mean for regulatory stuff? Do we have the right logging in place to be able to audit? Those sorts of things. It's a different way of thinking. So if we think about that, and so we're going to kind of switch gears now, kind of leave the DevOps behind, and let's talk a little bit about quality, because that's really my passion. Testing focus for sure, but I call myself a process consultant and testing advocate. But thinking about quality, how do we build it into our product? If you've listened to me talk about it, you've probably seen we talk about coffee. So a cup of coffee, how do you know it's a quality cup of coffee? I have tea here right now, but I have coffee in the morning. How do you know when your cup of coffee is good? I'm going to guess it's by the taste. Do you like that cappuccino with, pretty foam and maybe a pretty design? Or are you like me and like a good black cup of coffee? Or maybe you like sugar and cream in it. Or maybe you don't like coffee at all and would rather have tea. But when we talk about a quality cup of coffee, it's usually about the taste. Sometimes it includes the ambiance, your favorite coffee shop. I know when I asked my sister one day how she talked about it, she talked about going into that coffee shop. This was before lockdowns, and the ambiance, right? But that cup of coffee, what goes into the quality is more than the taste. It's more than the ambiance. They contribute. That's what the customer sees and feels. But without good beans, or perhaps how the beans were even grown, the altitude, when they were picked, and the roasting, right? You're likely not going to have that good taste. So it starts with that environment. Where were they grown? How were they picked? And continues right up until that barista puts that pretty design on top, if you like cappuccino. So we have to think about, how do we build that into our products, right? How do we take care of those beans and grow them? So one way is to start thinking about testing differently. Testing is not a phase, and it is an activity that happens throughout the delivery cycle. And that is a quote from Elizabeth Hendrickson. She has some amazing things to say at all times, but that's one that has stuck with me, because I think it's really critical that we start thinking differently. I see more and more teams understanding this small change. Testing is not a phase that happens at the end. Now, if we look at the test or the DevOps traditional kind of cycle, their loop, it has testing there as a phase, right? You start with the planning and coding and building and test. It says test is a phase. Just throws away everything I just mentioned. And so that bothers me a little bit. Now, Dan Ashby took the DevOps cycle and changed it a little bit, took out that test, and added this, we test here and here and here and here. right? So to show how testing is involved throughout, how it is an activity that can happen all along the way. The research from the state of DevOps showed that not only practices like version control and deployment automation, things like the continuous integration, on all of those things are important, but the testing, the continuous testing, right? The monitoring, the observability, those are key technical practices as well. So we really have to think about how do they fit in. So, me being what I do, and is I took that model and I changed it a little bit. I changed this infinite loop to something that made more sense to me from a testing perspective, from building quality in. So a traditional development cycle would start at that discover stage. And then you would kind of think, so discover, what's the idea? And then you plan for it a little bit at a high level. And then you seek to understand, what are we going to build? And then you build it. Building includes the coding and testing at that point in time. We deploy it, we release it to the customers, we observe how they use it, and then we learn something about that particular feature, or maybe we start on something new. But it's that infinite loop, goes around and around. Sometimes these loops go fast. If we think about this, say, from a story perspective, this may go pretty fast loop. If we think about it from a feature perspective, maybe it's a little bit longer, right? Some of these stages will go fast. Some of them will go slower, depending on how many unknowns maybe you have. So you want to be thinking about how it constantly moves from one to the other. And there will be feedback cycles, but you don't want to complicate it too much. So I took this little simple diagram and I added to it. So this is where the holistic testing comes in. When we think of testing from that holistic point of view, we realize that there's a lot of different kinds of testing. There's no beginning and no end in an infinite loop, but let's kind of start where we would think of starting normally, kind of at the discover stage, right? When we move to the left part of the cycle, right? So if we think about that left part of the cycle as the shift left, and then the right part of the cycle as the shift right, I can apply that idea because a lot of people have grabbed on to shift left and shift right, and I can grab it and run with it when it comes to an infinite loop. Most of the time I hear those two terms as applied to a linear line, right? And software development is not linear. There is no hard stop, no hard stop. There's just goes around and around. We keep developing, especially when we have product teams. Now let's talk a little about each of these individual things. So testing early. This happens really in the planning, the discovery kind of stages. And this is where testers often can add the most value. They can use their critical thinking skills, asking those what if questions, sometimes the questions that really annoy people. Perhaps they facilitate a risk storming exercise if a feature has many unknowns. They can help break down stories so they're testable. When we start thinking about risks, maybe I, ask questions about, what is the biggest risk? So it's very valuable to have testers in those first few stages to help bring out some of that. Seeking to understand. This is where practices like acceptance test driven development or behavior driven development really comes into its own. We can use practices like example mapping to help understand the business rules. We will want to include domain folks, programmers, operations, right? We want to be thinking about what kinds of testing do we want to do. We want to understand what kind of instrumentation we need to build in so that we can monitor and observe customer behavior. Perhaps we'll bring in support people if your organization has a support group, right? But this is where we're seeking to understand. If we're doing a feature or an epic, depending on what you call it, high-level business capability, that's what the customer field really wants. We're going to have it at a higher level understanding. As we get down into each individual story, we're going to go deeper and deeper, right? There'll be more detail. So it will have we'll use different tools. And then we start building, right? This is what most of you probably understand the best, right? This is where the coding and automating and testing of an individual story comes into place, and not necessarily in that order. I won't dwell on this stage because you are familiar with it, but I want to add that there are both automation tasks and human-centric testing activities, like exploratory testing, that happen here. And then we move across that, and we get into the deploy. I separate this out because this is where a real strong deployment pipeline shows its strength. Here's where we can see what is automated, perhaps what is human-centric testing. Some of you may call that manual. I'm not a fan of that term, but human-centric, right? People activities. And I'll touch on that in a moment here, but there are so many testing activities that can happen at this deployment stage, right? Often this is where we get the opportunity to test a lot of the quality attributes like load, performance, stability, recovery, and there's way too many to mention here. We want to test as much of that as we can while we're building, but quite often you can't test until you actually deploy. So deployment might be to a test environment, it might be to a staging environment, it could be lots of different places. But we want to make sure we test as early as possible. We want to be thinking about what needs to be tested, kind of where. And then we go on to the release. So release to the customer, right? Release to production. I call it a release cycle, right? We might use feature toggles to hide a feature, or the idea of a blue-green environment to enable extra testing. Perhaps we do some exploratory testing in here too. Years ago, when we heard the term testing in production, it usually meant bad things happened. It would affect our customers. I can remember testing in production to test a deploy, and we would use a fake credit card, we would use a fake account, and then we would have to back it all up, and then we'd have to do balancing with the credit card company, and it was scary every time we touched it. But today's tools allow us to do more of that safely and responsibly. And then we move to observe, right? This is where that instrumentation we thought of early on in the cycle and implemented during the build comes full circle. How does our customer use our products? Can we detect errors, maybe even earlier than the customer, and fix them before they know it happened, right? So I've been working on a team, and we just put out a new release. We changed how we deployed. We changed and had to do some major refactoring, but it is so much easier now. And we have better instrumentation to really watch to see what's happening. So we knew really quickly where some of the errors were before our customers found out about it. That's a good thing, right? We were able to fix and deploy very quickly. And that's what you need to have before you can ever get to that continuous delivery. You have to have a strategy for either a really good rollout, rollback, or a really good, how can we fix it quickly? Now, the last part of this cycle I talk about is learning. If we approach the idea of learning with a scientific mindset, we would form a hypothesis, right? If I try this, I think this will happen, right? We want to try experiments to improve. I'm in the middle of reading a book, Think Again, that talks about it. And so far, it's pretty good. I'm not finished it yet. But I really like some of the things that they're saying. So let's see how these activities actually apply to a deployment pipeline. Now, this is a simplified version of a continuous delivery pipeline. You'll see the blue are the automated activities that happen, and the yellow is the manual. So this picture is from Ashley Hunsberger and Lisa Crispin, and so they've used the word manual steps. Switch that off to say human-centric, right? People. Now, you'll see that the last two, the user acceptance testing and the deploy to production, are human-centric activities. So it takes somebody, even if it's just to push the big red button to say, we're ready to deploy it. So there's human interaction. There's things we depend on. So the accessibility and the exploratory testing, we have to finish that before we can deploy to staging. So it's kind of continuous delivery because we can move along, but we can't actually complete it till a human steps in. But it's there. As you can look at this, you can see all of the different things, all of the different testing that has to happen. And like I said, this is simplified. When we think about it, testing is at the heart of DevOps. So don't forget about it. Now, this is a simplified example of a continuous deployment pipeline, which means that the deployment is automatic, right? A developer checks in his code, right? It does the automatic static code analysis. It runs the unit tests. It runs all the API tests. When those all pass, it deploys. It runs the test suite for the user interface, the workflow tests. It runs the performance. It feeds into the staging, and it automatically deploys to production. The human-centric activities here are not dependent on releasing to production. We can do them in parallel, perhaps using a blue-green environment. So for those that might not know, you have two production environments, one called blue, one called green. Call them anything you want. So they are identical. So if the blue one is the live, what the customers are using, you'll deploy to the green, and maybe that's where you test and see how it reacts. As soon as you're happy with it, you make that live and switch, right? So we can do testing in parallel. We could also be using feature toggles to say, hey, we've tested that now, it looks good, flip it on. The code's already in production. It just wasn't turned on until you're ready to say it is. If we start thinking about it, and this is really what I want to stress, most of these steps are all about testing. Some are human-centric, some have been automated. So the state of DevOps, in 2018, they talked about testing as a key component of delivery. In 2019, it talked about high-performing teams and how the idea of restoring service faster, having a lower change rate, having a lower fail change rate, these were important. In 2020, it concentrates on platform services and change management. So I've looked at it from a kind of a change management perspective, and we'll try to kind of talk on that. I recommend read these reports because they give lots of really interesting insights into different teams and how they can do better. So some of the enablers that allow you to take advantage of these things, and I've mentioned some of these, the idea of feature toggles, right? Having testers and making testing visible, working together is really, really important. Thinking about quality attributes, and these are becoming more and more important all the time, like the reliability or security. Sometimes we have to kind of bring in specialists for a little while, but when everybody starts thinking about it, we will build it into our product, right? If we think about testing as an activity, that means that anybody can pick up a task. This helps to reduce the bottlenecks, right? So a lot of times I see a story and there'll be one testing task. It says, test this story. By having that one task, it's just reduced testing activities to an invisible thing. Nobody can help because they don't know what it means. So really start to think about the testing tasks and what is actually going on. Because if we create these and think about it, then other people can jump in and help. So these are just a few of the things that can enable teams to work towards that continuous delivery. And I do recognize that testing today is different. But I believe that testers are still important. They need to find different ways to work. But the team also needs to figure out ways to work with them differently. And there's lots out there on reading on that. Feel free. Testers, some of the things that they can do differently is really understand the concepts behind continuous integration and continuous delivery, understand how the version control works, how the merging and branching works, right? But they can also help define what tests need to go where and how that relates to the pipeline, right? Because testers have always been information providers, right? They can help build in those fast feedback loops. They can help identify some of those analytics. They can work with the business. What do you need to know? And then work with the teams to try to figure that out. And this will depend on your product, right? But one of the pieces that I find testers are really good at is really understanding the big picture. And I know many organizations have lots of different pieces, moving parts, third parties, and all kinds of other things. Identifying those dependencies in the system is often a tough thing, and testers, because they've been working with the system, often can help those identify those dependencies quite early. So if we think about testing early, right? Remember I said that they can demonstrate their thinking skills early, right? Asking questions, it's a skill. That critical thinking is a skill that people can develop. So when we start asking questions, it makes people think. So, and how we ask them. So for example, instead of saying, what is your biggest risk? Because when I ask product owners that, Sometimes they can know, but quite often they'll go, I don't know. So if I change that question and say, so what would be your biggest fear of happening if we implemented this? What's the worst case scenario? All of a sudden, they can come up with that. That worst case scenario is likely the biggest risk. But then that starts the conversation. Working through examples. So examples become tests. So when testers start thinking about examples and so one of my favorite things to do is when I ask a product owner to say, hey, how does this story work? And I'll say, walk me through an example. That should be pretty easy. Some find it easier than others, but if they struggle, then I might ask a different question. So if we did this, I would expect that. Is that true? Is that what you would expect? By working through these examples, it helps to build it concrete. It helps to make it real, and that team gets a better understanding of what they want to build, right? But for testers to be able to do this well, they have to be part of that cross-functional team. They have to be working hand in hand with the programmers and with the rest of the team. There has to be trust. Now, if we move to during development, right, during that build step, we want to work with programmers to decide what to automate, at what level. We want to help define those tests. We want to look at that test method, right? Maybe once the code is complete, we can pair test because that gives fast feedback. I like to do a show me. So, hey, programmer, can you show me what you just did? And then I can pair with the programmer to fix the bugs, right? We can pair together because they may not have even checked in their code. Fast feedback. I could, if I have nothing on my plate, I could help with the static code analysis. I could look at results, work with the programmers. I could even peer review code if I know the standards, if I can read code. So there's lots of different things that we can do during development, we being testers. I identify as a tester most of the time. Now, if we look at that shift right part of that cycle, right, this is all about the deployment pipeline, and this is a very, very simplified one. But you can see how thinking about which tests you need to run can be transferred to thinking about when they need to run, in which environment they need to run. So testers can help with this. They can help check the results, the deployment results. They can assist in monitoring those production analytics, maybe validate the findings, right? Think about the infrastructure that goes into the pipeline. Years ago, I worked with an infrastructure team, an infrastructure test team. They were set up specifically to test infrastructure. These days, we can spin up test environments and bring them down just as easily. And that's what we mean by infrastructure as code. That code can be kept in the same version control as the application code. We can test that. So let's wrap up so I have time for Q&A because that's my favorite part. I've been talking about the whole team, the delivery team. And we have to know that it's not only testers who think about quality, it is the delivery team. It should be the organizations. Testers do bring some essential skills, and they can lead the team into learning how to build quality in, but it is not their responsibility. Defining product quality belongs to the business stakeholders, but testers can ask good questions. So can the programmers, support people especially. But there's also process quality. how do we build the product? This belongs to the delivery team in the organization. It contributes to the product quality, but doesn't define it. Think about that coffee, right? The beans, the picking, how we roast them, that contributes to the final taste. But the quality is in the taste. If we don't have those things to build into it, the taste is often bitter, not so good. I also find by visualizing, getting something up on a whiteboard or in a collaborative tool if you're remote, really helps to build some of that understanding faster. You'll have seen me, I have a virtual whiteboard because it helps connect dots with what I'm saying. So we want to be thinking, how can we do things better? Continual learning means a no blame culture. People willing to try to innovate, try to experiment. It means mistakes will be made, but without mistakes, there is no learning. What we want to do is make those mistakes small, not something that lasts 3 months, but what can we do quick, right? So we can have fast learning. Use that scientific mindset to experiment and grow. How managers, executives, they need to think about providing that environment. How can change happen in the environment you have right now? An analogy I like to think of here is growing your garden, because I'm out in my garden these days, or maybe even just a pot of flowers if you don't have a garden. You don't beat up the plants to make them grow. You don't yell at them. You don't tell them to grow faster. It's not going to help. You look at the environment. Do they have enough sunshine? Are you watering too little, too much? The same goes with teams. Micromanaging doesn't help them. Think too much water. But completely hands off might not be good either. Because sometimes we have to pick weeds, right? You have to help get rid of those obstacles. So learn, experiment, figure out how to work with that team. How do you, if you have a community of testers, how do you share that information? How do you get teams to talk about quality and to build quality in? How can you provide the environment that is just right? So the last story I'm going to leave you with is, often when I go into a conference and I'm giving a talk, I will ask the attendees, so how many of you have felt the magic of being on a really high productive team? People either shoot up their hands really fast, or they kind of go like this slow. And some of them just look at me like I'm crazy. So those ones that shoot up their hand really fast, they know that magic. They have been on a high productive team. If they're lucky, they will have been on more than one. The ones that go slow, those are the ones that they can feel it. They know that it's close, but it's not quite there. Those are the teams where you can look at as a manager and say, okay, what might we be able to do to get it past that so that they shoot up their hands and feel that magic? The ones that look at you like you're crazy, you need to look harder. What's going on? What's wrong with this environment? Is there too much acid? Do I need something different? Right? So experiment, have fun doing it. You will make mistakes, but it's all learning in the long run. These are references that I've mentioned. I've taken things from So please see them. This is my contact info. I promised. You can email me if you have any questions or want to find something out. My email is janet@agiletester.ca. You can ask me about our books. You can ask me about the Agile Testing Fellowship. You can ask me about anything that was on our talk today. But it's time for questions now. So I look forward to that.